And I'm just going to change my view. Okay. Okay. So, and here's somebody coming in. There we go. Welcome to, I'm muting all. Welcome to another year of Torah study. I hope everybody had a restful summer. And now as we gear up for the high holidays in the month of Elul, starting another academic year of Torah study and other classes that are resuming as well. So our portion this week is Teitzei, and it's on page 1112 in the Teitzei, or Deuteronomy chapter 21, beginning with verse 10 in whatever edition Chumash you have. And as you're turning to the page, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So before we get into a section of the Torah portion that I wanted us to look at, I wanted to just have us understand that for the rabbis, in determining the calendar and figuring out when the new year begins, because there was a debate among the rabbis, do we maintain the biblical calendar that the first of the year should be the month of Nisan, as the Torah says and as the Bible says, or do we shift the new year to now, the month of Tishrei? And as they debated that and came to the conclusion that the month of Tishrei is the new year, their discussion of the Torah portions that are read throughout the year are then become associated with the holidays or observances that are close by. So the month of Elul, say it this way, the fast day of Tisha B'Av marks for the rabbis this historic occasion that not only has historical significance, and in that it was the destruction of the temple by the Romans, but it also has great spiritual and societal impact. Judaism and Jewish society faced tremendous turmoil because the usual way of observing ritual came to an abrupt stop with the destruction of the temple, and there had to be an alternative. So the idea of prayer, observance of Shabbat and holidays at home and in synagogue was an abrupt shift. And to help that shift along, the rabbis also emphasized what the spiritual significance of each season was and how the Torah reading is associated with that season. So after the destruction of the temple and its observance on the 9th day of the month of Av, the rabbis insisted that the prophetic readings for each Torah reading would be ones that would convey a sense of comfort. And they also said that the Torah readings themselves highlight the mood of the season. So the book of Deuteronomy, its focus is Moses. Well, the context is that Moses is speaking to the people during the 40th year after leaving Egypt. And he, by speaking to them, is preparing them for the next phase of their life. That is, entering the land, settling the land and establishing Israelite society in the land. Instead of practicing in the desert, they now will put it into practice in the land of Israel in a more settled environment. And so Moses, in his speech to the people, reminds them of the laws that are to be observed and ensure that the people will follow the covenant. So this week's portion, Teitzei, like I said, beginning on page 1112, highlights some of these laws. And in fact, as the commentary below the line says, this portion contains more of the 613 commandments than any other portion in the entire Torah. So there are 72 of the 613 commandments, so more than 10% of the commandments are found here in this portion. And most of the portion focuses on laws between our fellow human beings and also laws related to treatment of animals. There are laws, and the laws between our fellow human beings are business related and also marital relationships, like there's a law about divorce. There are also other sundry laws when you go out to war, captives and the treatment of captives, etc. So there's a nice variety of laws contained here. So I've talked other times about the beginning of the portion. So what I'd like to do is turn to page 1115 to the start of chapter 22. So 1115 in Eitz Chaim Chumash, or whatever Chumash you're using, find chapter 22 of Deuteronomy. And I'd like to read together some of these verses here and discuss a little bit the impact of these laws, like understanding what is so special about these laws that seem to be common sense. So, 11:15. Lo tir'eh et shor achicha, o et seo nidachim, v'hit alamta mehem, v'hashev teshivem le'achicha. So I'm going to translate it literally. You should not see the ox of your brother. So that is, your brother here is not literally your brother, but your fellow citizen, your fellow Israelite, okay? Don't see the ox of your fellow Israelite or his sheep. Nidachim would be roaming around, or it says here, gone astray. Don't let yourself see the ox or sheep of your neighbor go astray. So it's saying it in the negative, and so we're going to have to adjust it a little bit to see exactly what it's trying to say. And don't ignore them. Okay, so in other words, say it in the positive. If you see the ox or sheep of your fellow Israelite roaming around, wandering aimlessly, don't ignore them. You should return them to your fellow citizen. Okay? So in other words, if you see a sheep or an ox wandering around, like outside of its pen or ranch or corral, you cannot just let it continue to wander. Your responsibility is to return it. Now, verse 2, before we get into some details here, verse 2, Ve'im lo karov achicha elecha, ve'lo yedato, va'asafto el toch beitecha, v'haya imcha ad derosh achicha oto, v'hashevoto lo. And if your fellow Israelite who owns the ox or the sheep is not close to you and you do not know him, so in other words, close to you could be physical distance, close to you could be you know him or know of him. So if you don't know him, if he's not close to you physically or in relationship-wise, and you don't know him, you gather the ox or the sheep into your house, that is, onto your property, and it should be with you until your fellow citizen who owns the ox or the sheep comes asking for it. And then you return it to him. And verse 3, V'chein ta'aseh lachamoro, V'chein ta'aseh lesimlato, V'chein ta'aseh l'chol avedat achicha asher tovad mimenu, umitzata lo tuchal lehit alem. And so should you do for his donkey, and so should you do for his garment, and so should you do for anything that your fellow Israelite loses, for all lost items that your fellow citizen loses, and you find, you are not able to ignore it. Okay, so we might say, first of all, that verse 3 should have been included in verse 1. That, in other words, it should say, don't ignore your fellow Israelites' ox, sheep, donkey, garment, or any lost item. It's just interesting that it puts all the other categories of lost items in verse 3 and not in verse 1. Perhaps verse 1 contains the ox and the sheep because that's the more common animals that Israelites own. But Israelites do own donkeys, and there are milking cows and goats and things like that too. So it's just interesting to me, just the format of the line. The other element is the more the level of responsibility that's required here, because the Mishnah and especially the Talmud spend a lot of time discussing this responsibility. So caring for lost items, the rabbis take that mitzvah very, very seriously. They first have to define what a lost item is. So in other words, if somebody leaves something in the public domain, when does it become lost? When is it considered as if the owner of the item that gets lost forgets about it and figures that it's lost forever? So that is not what's being considered here. I'm just adding layers, the legalities and the layers of the discussion to the topic, like the foundation for the topic. So what does it mean? Like, how do you define something that's lost? So if you see, for example, coins that are kind of randomly found on the ground, as opposed to seeing a money purse on the ground with some coins in it and out of it, random coins you find on the ground would be considered to be lost, whereas a money purse on the ground, no, random coins on the ground could be allowed for someone who finds it to take it and have it be his own. A money purse on the ground with money coins still in it and some outside of it, that then becomes lost, and one could assume that a person would notice that their money purse has gone missing and would want to look for it. Whereas random coins, a person doesn't recognize that random coins have gone missing until much, much later, and then understands most likely they were lost in the public domain and they're lost forever. So a person becomes discouraged for finding it, and so that discouragement makes the item no longer lost but forgotten. Lost means that the owner hopes to someday find it. So therefore, every human being, because of the laws here in this chapter, this portion of Deuteronomy, and other places in Deuteronomy, and also in the book of Leviticus, every Israelite human being understands that they are going to be cared for and looked out for by their fellow Israelites. And so this law about lost items is an example of that. So if one's sheep or if one's animal goes astray, one can assume that the animal will someday be brought back. So how does the owner of the animal who's gone astray hope to get the animal back? The Torah here does not tell us the process, right? You're supposed to return. You're supposed to take care of the animal until the owner comes looking for it. How's the owner supposed to come and look for it? So that also is taught to us in the Mishnah and in the Talmud. So you're supposed to advertise. If you find a lost item, an item such that you can, when you find it, it's in a condition in which it's not meant to be forgotten, but rather seems to be lost and should be returned. If you see any item, an animal or an inanimate object, one has to announce that one has found it. And you're supposed to announce it in the synagogue. And you're also, if the temple was standing in Jerusalem, you're supposed to announce it in the temple in Jerusalem. And you're supposed to announce it for 3 straight pilgrimage holidays. So if you find the item before Passover, then you're supposed to go, because every Israelite goes to the temple for Passover to observe the holiday, and there'll be a lost and found, or a place in which lost and found objects from throughout Israel will be advertised. So you're supposed to announce it there for Passover, for Shavuot, and Sukkot. So no matter what time of year the item is lost, the next 3 holidays are supposed to be the time to announce it. And it's only after the 3rd holiday, if the item is not claimed, then the person who finds it can keep it. Okay, so that's not found here, but it's based on the idea, and you're supposed to hold on to it until the owner of the animal or object looks for it. Okay? The other thing is there's a responsibility of the person who finds the item or the animal to take care of it appropriately. So, for example, if you find an animal, you're supposed to bring that animal into your own animal's shed, and you're supposed to feed it, and you're supposed to make sure that it stays healthy, right? It can be, you're allowed to work the animal if the animal's a working animal, but you're not allowed to overwork it, because that would be abusing somebody else's property. You're not allowed to wear the garment because you're abusing somebody else's garment, right? So take care of the item. If it's an animal, feed the animal, and then you can expect that if you have outlaid some expenses to take care of the item or the animal, that the owner of the animal or the item is supposed to pay you back in gratitude for taking care of the animal, and just a matter of expenses. Okay, so all of that based on these three verses. Well, actually, we can add verse 4. Lo tir'eh et chamor achicha o shoro noflim baderech v'hitalamta mehem hakem takimimo. Right? If you see your fellow Israelites' animal fall on the road, you're supposed to not ignore it, but take care of it too. So you're supposed to, take whatever veterinary skills as Israelites had back in the time of the Torah. You're supposed to do that, to take care of the animal, and it would be understood that once the animal was found and reclaimed by the owner, that the owner would pay you back. Okay, so I just wanted to focus on that and to highlight all these other conditions that the rabbis add to it that further reinforce the idea of how much of a caring community the Israelite community is, and by extension, how much of a caring community the Jewish community is, right? So that in time, when Israel was living in the land of Israel, one could assume that society, based on this law and many others, was one in which nobody was poor, nobody didn't have a home, nobody wasn't cared for. Right? So even though the book of Deuteronomy in a portion Re'eh 2 weeks ago said there will always be poor and disadvantaged in the community, it did in the same breath say, well, this is how you're supposed to take care of the poor and the disadvantaged in the community, so that really there won't be any poor. Right? And even though the Torah doesn't talk about this, the rabbis did say, a Jewish community is noted by its soup kitchen and other organizations that take care of the poor in the community. There's what's known, like in very Orthodox communities, you have something known as a gemach, which is 3 Hebrew letters, gimel, mem, chet, which stands for 2 Hebrew words, gimilut. So the first 2 letters of that word, gemilut, gimel mem, chesed. So the bestowing of kindness. So a gemach is a gemilut chesed fund, and mostly that's for poor brides and their families to be able to find wedding dresses and other things to enhance the wedding ceremony. So I have experience with this, not like my son and daughter-in-law needed this, but their friends last year when they got married, some of their friends went to Teaneck, which has a large Orthodox community in New Jersey, and went to the Gemach and got kind of props to use for the dancing during the reception at my son and daughter-in-law's wedding. So And then so they got them from the Gemach. They paid. It's like going to Goodwill, right? You go to the Goodwill store and you pay a minimal amount for clothing there. The same with the Gemach. And then they went back to the Gemach sometime after the wedding and gave it back, or sold it back to the Gemach afterwards. So that's how it works in the community, so that everybody in the community, no matter their wealth, can have what would be, in the same language as Gemach, a freiliche wedding, a very joyous wedding. So, but this, and if you read Jewish historical sources over the centuries from Europe, we understand that when a community gets established, and this happens in America too, the first thing a community will do in a new area is buy land for a cemetery. The second thing they will do is set up these charitable organizations to be sure that that people will be cared for. So this happens in America, right? 1650s, when the first Jews arrived in New Amsterdam, in America. There are records from the synagogue She'eret Israel, which means the remnant of Israel, and it's an appropriate name because this is a boatload of Jews who came from Brazil, escaping the Inquisition, and coming to this new land that Jews and Westerners had never been to before. And you can imagine that the remnant of Israel is a good name for this community. And there are records of She'eret Israel organizing as a synagogue, buying land in what was then Manhattan for a cemetery, and setting up all these, buying a building eventually for a synagogue, etc., etc. But all of this is based on the idea that this is a rabbinic idea. The Torah doesn't say it. Kol Yisrael arevim zeh bazeh. All of Israel is responsible for one another. Okay, another thing I wanted to look at in this week's portion is if we turn to page 1122. And I want to, beginning with verse 3. So this is chapter 23, beginning with verse 3. On page 1122, you have some laws here related to who we are allowed to marry. So this isn't sexual impropriety that we have a long list of in the book of Leviticus, but rather who is eligible for an Israelite to marry, to then become part of the community of Israel, right? So it says in verse 3, Lo yavo mamzer bikahal Adonai, gam dur asiri lo yavo lo bikahal Adonai. A mamzer is not allowed into the congregation of God. Okay, so just interesting how the community of Israel is described in this verse. It is God's congregation. It's not B'nai Yisrael. It's not Am Yisrael. It's Kahal Adonai, God's congregation, which adds a level of holiness and sanctity to the community. So we're not just the people of Israel that lives in the land of Israel. We are God's holy congregation. Okay? So in describing God's holy congregation, a mamzer is not allowed to enter the congregation, and I'll talk about mamzer in a moment, and up to the 10th generation of the mamzer, he should not enter into the congregation of God. So mamzer is described here. Now, we know in Yiddish what a mamzer is, okay? So, and that's just the stereotype that based on this verse here and others, and also from the Mishnah and the Talmud, about how the person's status is affected, and therefore that status is understood, is applied in a negative way to a person today. But mamzer is misbegotten. And what does that mean? Who is a mamzer? So if you look below, so all the way in the bottom of the page, in the halacha lamasa, in the gray box. So these boxes appear on some of the pages in the Chumash to tell us what the law is based on the verse. So Hebrew mamzer, according to Jewish law, this refers to the offspring of adultery or incest, not to those born out of wedlock. Okay, so chapter 18 of Leviticus describes the prohibited sexual relations. So a child born a child born as a result of this illicit sexual relationship, that child is called a mamzer. So the most common illicit sexual relationship in the time of the rabbis and the time of the Torah would be adultery and incest. Okay, but there are other illicit relationships too. But adultery and incest. So a child of adultery or incest is considered a mamzer. Now, the rest of the gray box says that the CJLS, that is the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, has adopted evidentiary procedures to render this rule inoperative because it penalizes children for the sins of their parents, contrary to the teaching of Deuteronomy 24. Okay, so in all my years of being a pulpit rabbi, I have never, when I've officiated at a wedding, understood that either partner who I'm about to officiate for their wedding is a mamzer. Now, I haven't asked so many detailed questions. So I was taught in rabbinical school, you only ask questions that you want to know the answers to. You don't ask extra questions. Okay, so the questions I need to know, the questions for which the answers I need to know are, when a couple comes to me, what is your Hebrew name? What is your father's Hebrew name? What is your mother's Hebrew name? So that give me enough answers to understand whether that person is Jewish or not, based on the conservative movement's understanding of who is a Jew. Okay? I also need to know whether either partner was married before and who they were married to. So it did come up once that the groom was married before, but he was married to somebody not Jewish. So therefore, that made it easier. So in other words, I can only officiate at a marriage for people who are permitted to marry each other in a Jewish way. So the couple both parties need to be Jewish based on the definition of who is a Jew of the conservative movement, that is, converted according to Jewish law, or the child of at least a Jewish mother. But no, so a Jewish mother, right? Yes, that's enough to say there, because if it's just a Jewish father, that's not enough. It has to be a Jewish mother, and they have to be permitted to marry each other. That is, that if they'd been married before, they have a legal document showing that they've been divorced. So not only do they need to have a civil divorce, and I need to know the date in which the civil divorce was proclaimed, but they also, if they were married to somebody Jewish, they also need to have a get. Okay, so that if they don't have a get, then that becomes a longer process, we have to have enough time before the scheduled date of the wedding to ensure that a get can be issued. Okay, I don't ask whether either partner, whether they are the biological child of their parents. I just assume that they are. I do not ask if unless they tell me a story, I do not ask for the story about their birth. The name of their mother and the name of their father is all I need. So I've never come across, in my 36 years of being a rabbi, a mamzer. Okay, but in the time of the rabbis, this could have been more common. Okay, and certainly in the world today, a child of an adulterous relationship is common. Okay, but as far as I know, haven't officiated at a wedding of such a person. The rabbis, now back to this gray box, say that in order for us to be considered a godly congregation, there are conditions that apply to our status that would not apply if we were just a secular society. Secular society might be able to condone or allow all people to be members of society. Doesn't matter their birth origin, they're all allowed to be part of society. Secular society might allow that. Now, there were rules about children born out of wedlock in British law and other European law, because those laws are based also on the Christian Bible. Okay, so our laws, Jewish law, because it's religious law, adds a religious component to who is eligible to be part of the religious society. Okay, so this religious rule is, so if parents flaunt the sexual relationship laws, then, and if they're not caught, if they are caught, they're supposed to be executed. But if they're not caught, then their child is punished by not being allowed to be formally part of the community. Now, there are rules according to rabbinic law as to how much a mamzer can participate in the community. According to rabbinic law, a mamzer is only allowed to marry another mamzer. And that law applies for 10 generations. It goes 10 generations forward. So it keeps the mamzer community self-isolated, with self-contained within the broader Israelite community, and causes a stigma to be attached to that mamzer community. So for in other words, before, let's say there were last names in the community, so people could have the last name of Cohen or Levy, but they could have the last name of mamzer. And mamzer, the last name just tells you who you are, right? So, if someone is Snyder is their last name, well, they're a tailor because that's what Snyder means. Or Cooper, they're a barrel maker, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes the occupation determines what your last name is. Sometimes your status can determine what your last name is. So it's possible that mamzers in the community had the last name of mamzer, or if they didn't have the last name, it might be that mamzer was added to their name. So it could be Yosef ben Yaakov HaMamzer. So to be sure that everybody in the community knew. So it's terrible to cast the stigma, which is why the Conservative Movement Law Committee did away with casting this stigma and not carrying forward this idea of mamzer. But in Torah times and in early Israel, but we don't have examples of this really from the Bible that talks about cases of people who are mamzers and how they were dealt with in the community. We have to assume that until the time of the rabbis, the law of the mamzer applied. So that now, it also, in the commentary below, says something interesting about why not to, in the gray box, what could be a basis for not maintaining the mamzer law today. And the idea is that we are conflicted in the Torah as who's responsible for our actions. Is each person and each person alone responsible for their action, or does their action bear consequence on their children and their descendants? And that is a matter of debate within the Torah and within the prophets as well. There are those who say, so therefore the law of mamzer, what does the child have to do? Why should the child of this illicit relationship bear the brunt of the punishment when the child had nothing to do with it? It's the parents who had something to do with it and everything to do with it, and it's the parents who should be punished. Why does the punishment get meted out on the child and then the next 9 subsequent generations, right? So that's why the conservative movement has said, we don't apply this rule anymore, or we attach conditions to it so that we can never apply the law of mamzer anymore. But at the same time, verse 4 has a different idea of how the rabbis changed the law. So the rabbis didn't change the mamzer law. They didn't see a moral reason or moral outcry enough from the community to demand the rabbis to find some kind of loophole. But they did find a loophole with verse 4. Lo yavo Amoni umoavi bikahal Adonai, gam dur asiri lo yavo lahem bikahal Adonai ad olam. An Ammonite and a Moabite cannot enter into God's congregation up through the 10th generation. They should not enter. He should not enter into God's congregation forever. So, those of us who know our Bible know that the book of Ruth is about Ruth the Moabite. And Ruth the Moabite marries Boaz the Israelite in what seems to be a flagrant violation of this law right here. An Ammonite and a Moabite should not enter into the congregation of God through the 10th generation. A Moabite or an Ammonite should not enter forever. Okay, so 10th generation for the rabbis means forever. Who can really project that far into the future? But so the book of Ruth is in the Bible. Therefore, it means that the contents of the book of Ruth are acceptable to the rabbinic notion of what it means, what the Bible means, and what the Bible teaches. If the rabbis did not like anything about the book of Ruth, they would not have allowed the book of Ruth to be in the Bible. The book of Ruth is in the Bible. Therefore, we have to question the idea about this law right here. How could it be that a Moabite has now entered into the congregation of God? into the Israelite community. And not only is the book of Ruth in the Bible in flagrant opposition to this law, but who is the product of Ruth and Boaz's relationship? None other than their great-grandson, King David. Okay, so because King David is the king of Israel, and now we have an origin story that says that his great-grandmother was a Moabite, that forces the rabbis to re-understand or reinterpret this verse. So it's written gender specifically. Now, we know that Hebrew is a gender-specific language. So, and the Torah, therefore, and when we write in Hebrew, we can't help but be gender-specific, even though our intention might be to be gender-neutral. It's almost impossible to be gender-neutral in Hebrew. So the Hebrew literally says an Ammonite or Moabite man should not enter into the congregation of God to the 10th generation. He should not enter into the congregation of God forever. Okay, so that's literally what the verse says. The rabbis then apply the literal reading of the verse to the law. All right, now Ruth is a Moabite woman. It's okay for women, Ammonite women and Moabite women, to enter into the community of Israel. It is forbidden for Ammonite men and Moabite men to enter into the community of Israel. Women in the time of the Bible, in the time of the Torah, Bible, and rabbis, women are man's property and therefore become part of the man's household. An Israelite woman marrying a Moabite man would then mean that she would be going into the Moabite or Ammonite community, and that Israelite woman would be lost to the Israelite community forever. Her child would be considered, in the time of the rabbis, in the time of the Bible, her child would be considered an Ammonite or Moabite, okay? Because she's an Israelite woman marrying an Ammonite or Moabite man, okay? The man determines the tribal affiliation and land holdings. In Judaism today, it's the woman who determines the religion of the child. So a non-Jewish man marrying an Israelite woman would be, it's not ideal, but the child is considered Jewish. Okay? So I'm just bringing up verse 4 to us to understand that how the rabbis were willing to reinterpret verse 4, but not willing to reinterpret verse 3. Okay, so it's just interesting, so in the broader context of the ethical laws that are mentioned here, what were the rabbis willing to interpret away so that the law makes it harder to follow, or almost saying we don't follow this law anymore, and what laws stay behind? So that's the process of ethics in law, that they are not meant. So when something is written down in the Torah, it's not meant to be understood exactly that way forever. It is understood by the rabbis that we understand the context at the time, and we continue to understand the context for the ethics, so that when ethics do change, and they will, ethical principles, values change, then so too that the law, Jewish law, can change along with the times. Any thoughts or comments about any of this? Okay, it's good to see everybody today. Hope everybody has a good rest of the day and the rest of the week. And we'll see you next Wednesday.